So here we are, the final session of our Achieving Net Zero conference, and I am delighted about this session on two fronts. One is because we spend an awful lot of time debating carbon in the whole energy, environment, net zero debate, but not enough attention, I believe, on the role of nature, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this session, getting nature positive. We know that nature and biodiversity, the degradation of those, plays a big role in exacerbating the climate change challenge and climate crisis. So if we can reverse that, we're really, really onto something. And we also know from businesses there's huge consumer demand for getting this right too. So many reasons to act. So that is one reason I'm really pleased about this session. The second is actually it's going to be chaired and moderated by Tanya Kumar, who's our head of decarbonisation at the CBI. And Tanya, if you just forgive me, you are the inspiration, the ideas, the brains, and the heavy lifting behind an awful lot of this conference. I know it's a team effort, but you've played a really, really big role. So it's fantastic that you're going to steer us through this final session. Really well done. And to help you do that, we've got a terrific lineup and a terrific panel. Anna Bartle from the Estee Lauder companies, Andrea Ledward from DEFRA, Minette Batters from the National Farmers Union, and Richard Warnford from Northumbrian Water Group. Please join me on stage along with Tanya for this final session. All yours.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for that introduction. I wasn't expecting it at all, but I am really excited to be chairing this panel, and it's no intention that it is our sort of penultimate session of the day, but that doesn't make it less important than what we have been discussing over the last 2 days, nature and getting nature positive. And I had a great opportunity actually to represent the CBI at COP26 last year, and I was really stunned actually by just the focus in parts around nature, but also particularly around resilience, loss and damage, and that's something that I really want to bring out of the conversation today, because we do need to see, as David Craig said yesterday, nature being part of the solution to achieving net zero. So without further ado, I'm going to just break straight into the questions to this wonderful panel that we have today and really ask them to start off the session to say, you know, how do we actually get nature to be seen as part of the solution to achieving net zero? Why are we seeing these things in two different parts and in different silos? And where do we go next from this? So, Anna, can I start off with yourself?
Sure. I mean, I think for those that were lucky enough to be here yesterday, it was an absolutely terrific day, and I certainly heard a consistent theme throughout of not just talking about climate, but talking about it in the same breath as nature. So that felt like an incredible stride already from where we had been at COP26 last November. But as you rightly say, it's not a conversation that's happening enough of the time with enough amplification and enough understanding behind it at the moment. So there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made. But I thought that David Craig from TNFD put it so well yesterday, and it was a soundbite that I took from him when he said you can only be net zero if you're nature positive, and it really is that simple. The two are absolutely fundamentally innately related, and we have to start speaking about them in absolutely the same breath and approaching them as twin emergencies, twin crises. That said, it's sort of easier said than done. I spend a lot of my time looking at our language and our messaging for the company and how we land with our consumers. We've got incredible exposure that we can have in the UK alone, that we're speaking to around about 16 million consumers at any given time. So our capacity to be able to change that conversation and drive and fuel some of that conversation is quite immense. But it's what you say that really counts. And I've been very interested recently in how we seem to have lost our connection with the language around this debate. A few years ago, we were all talking about ecosystems. And that was something that intrinsic in that language is this implicit understanding that the two are all connected. It acknowledges the interconnection between all of these elements and understands that climate is nature and nature is climate. And then I think with the absolute ramping up and acute sense of urgency around the climate debate, some of that language has fallen away. We've stopped talking about the systemic nature of this issue, and we've got very mono-focused around climate, the climate emergency, climate disaster, and so forth. So I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a little bit of an inflection point. I feel very optimistic and positive that we're beginning to see a change in this language, and you'll hear more and more of it coming through, I think. So even just looking back to last November, the report that Accenture had produced with the UNGC, lots of fascinating statistics within it, but one that really stayed with me was that at that point, not that long ago, only 6 months ago, but 1 in 5 global CEOs at that point in time didn't even recognize biodiversity as a risk to their business. I wonder how that has changed now. Even if they're not formally recognizing it, I can see at these conferences that I go to, the conversations I go to, the cohorts and allies that I meet with in this world, it's becoming more prevalent, and for that reason I feel optimistic.
Minette, just passing on to yourself, National Farmers Union, this is intrinsically, so important to agriculture and the whole of the industry. So from your perspective, how do we get every part of the business community, every sector engaging with nature?
Well, you're absolutely right about every sector and every part of our economy engaging with it. And I think the danger is we tend to talk about nature in isolation, as it is something over there. And to a certain extent, government language at the moment isn't helping that. Take 30% of land out of production, legislated targets on nature, on trees, on water. And actually, we've got to look at all of this in the round. We've got to do everything, and we expect more out of our land use than we have ever expected. We have massive commitments on housing. We have massive commitments on green energy. We have legislated targets, and rightly so, on nature. But we also have to produce food, and we have to do all of these things together. And nature, I think, what a farmed landscape shows is nature is at the heart of a healthy farmed landscape. A healthy soil is at the heart of any great farming business. So we've got to do it all as one. And something at the NFU that we've been working on a lot is effectively developing new trades. So looking at very much the carbon market, but also looking at water quality, at biodiversity, and really wanting to establish the governance principles of how you stack onto a farmed landscape. So we face the double challenge now of global warming and global feeding. Two really, and they're both working together, and we can't do one without the other. We have to feed this world, and we have to deal with climate change. And luckily enough, actually, by feeding the world more sustainably, we can deal with climate change. And nature has to be the positive outcome out of getting those two right. But the stakes are very, very high now. So for policymakers, the challenge has never been greater. And what we have tried to do is really work on the policies that are needed and set the governance principles, if you like, for those trades, so you can stack and stack and stack, and you can bring public and private sector together, which is absolutely essential. If we leave them in isolation, we will never get to nature positive. We have to bring it all together.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that's a call for you to come in on sort of government language, but also reflecting on the balance between, domestic language and also international language on nature. There's something quite powerful when it comes to nature, that it connects every country globally, and it sort of transcends, the developed and the developing world. So how does that sort of play out in government conversations?
Yeah, sure, and thank you for the invitation. I was responsible for Nature and Nature Day at COP26 last year, actually, and also have all the negotiating teams doing negotiating the Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15 later this year. So it's a great opportunity to talk about why it matters. And I think it matters not because it's an outcome in itself. Being nature positive, I think, is absolutely essential, because you don't get to food security, and you don't get to net zero, and you don't get to a healthy planet and controlling zoonotic diseases and others without nature. So I think there's 3 particular kind of areas of action that are really critical. I think the first thing is getting the right political signals. So one of the big achievements at COP26 was actually not only having a lot of theatre, there was a lot of commitments as well made in relation to nature. There was a lot of money put on the table, new money, to drive change. There was also 141 countries that signed up to halt and reverse forest loss and the loss of other critical ecosystems. So it was the political settlement that was then locked in through the Glasgow Climate Pact, which locked in the need to look at critical ecosystems. Then earlier this year, we locked that in through UNEA, so the United Nations Environment Assembly, where we locked in language about nature-based solutions and the importance of nature-based solutions underpinning international action. So the first thing is to say we need these big political signals locking in these major multilateral fora. I think the second thing is then we need to recognise and quantify the benefits that nature brings, particularly if you think about mitigation. Net land use is responsible for 25% of global emissions. And we know that the big prize is that a third of the gap that we need to close to get to 1.5 degrees comes through nature and comes through protecting and restoring critical ecosystems. We also know that if you look at adaptation, we know that the most cost-effective solutions, particularly in developing countries, come through nature, whether it's mangrove protection, whether it's looking at your grasslands, your savanna, protecting your forests. So we know and we can quantify, but we haven't done enough of that. I think people have been very focused on energy as the very big prize in these very early days, and I think now we're just starting to get into land use and agriculture. And I think the UK's NDC is a good start into thinking about how we can quantify some of the benefits and the outcomes you can get through looking at peat restoration, for example, in trees. But I think quantification is essential. And then we need to do what we know works, and there are massive win-wins here. So the win-wins are all about sustainable agriculture. They're all about protection and restoration of land. They're all about stopping degradation of land. And they're all about kind of 30 by 30, which is this protection and conservation measures, as well as subsidy reform. And I think those are all the things we know what works, and we just now need to send the market signals that those are the things that the regulation and the legal frameworks are going to be putting in place to incentivize doing the right things. So I think the politics, the kind of quantification, and I think looking at putting in those national plans, which I think we have got in the UK now through the Environment Act. And I see around different developing countries as well, there's a different level of maturity. Some places like Colombia, they have a very advanced kind of way of thinking about their embedding nature within its core economic and political decision making. And you see now the countries that are taking it very seriously because it's an existential risk, but also because it's a massive economic opportunity for those countries. And they're locking it in through their national plans, their NDCs, something called the MBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Adaptation Plans. And so as you start looking at it at a national level, it will give a market a very clear signal, and it will give investors very clear opportunities and signals. So I think those are where we're certainly focusing our attention, the kind of global frameworks, the national level kind of infrastructure that you need, as well as then examples of actually what works.
Thank you, Richard. That's also an opportune moment to talk about Northumbrian water, a sector that has been looking at nature for a very long time. Just talk us through how you've encompassed nature in your own sort of strategy, but also what have been some of those market signals that you've been looking for from government that's enabled you to set your net zero target whilst also including nature as part of that?
Yeah, so the water sector has set a net zero target for 2030. There's a huge number of aspects of that, as you might imagine, from all kinds of renewable power, from sort of hydro through to power from poo, as we all like to call it. It's our bread and butter, so we always use the phrase, so excuse us. Wind, you know, all of these things are all part of that as well. So it's something that I think the sector's really been quite ambitious about. So 2030, Northumbrian has an aim to do that by 2027. So this is, you know, a couple of decades ahead of some of the other sectors. So we're very proud to be heading in that direction. I think nature-based solutions are a really big part of this, but I still think there's quite a long way to go. So whilst we have been, you know, I think ahead of the game a little bit in our thinking, I think there's still quite a long way to go, and I think some of the things that sometimes get in the way. I think sometimes we heard from the last speaker before we all joined about accountancy and how the accountants are going to be the solution, and there's a bit of truth in that somewhere. So I think being able to value it, to pick up the point, and be able to consistently value nature. Because I think we all, if anybody's cracked that, please catch me afterwards, because it seems to be pretty difficult. So if we can really crack that, I think we'll crack the whole thing. Sometimes in a sector like ours, that you get mixed messages. So you might get messages about resilience that are really quite important. So on things like flooding, things like water resources, if you like, the real fundamentals of what we do as a sector. Now, and we all passionately care about nature too, but unless, I suppose, the regulation and the legislation goes hand in hand with that, naturally, there's sometimes going to be a bias towards the resilience things when you're in a place where you're trying to keep bills at an affordable level. So I think as a sector, we've done really well, but I think there's some of the things will get in the way. And having real consistent signals with things like resilience alongside nature.
And I think just looking at the moment, the current context, one area that I want to pick up across all of us is we spoke earlier around the geopolitical context that we're in at the moment and also the pressures on businesses at the moment. So many in the room are being called upon to set net zero targets. We had Thomas Hale yesterday from Oxford University asking everyone who signed up to Race to Resilience. The business community and others, there's an overwhelming sense of there's a lot to prioritise and respond to at the moment. How do you add nature to that long list of priorities? Does it get deprioritised in those boardroom discussions? So just a bit of an open question to the entire panel, and perhaps, Minette, starting with yourself at the moment, thinking about you've got an energy security crisis, and actually already a lot of commentators, we see this as also a food security crisis as well. Should we be leveraging that to act on nature and food production in the same way that we have the calls for let's now ramp up work on energy efficiency? Could we see the same when it comes to nature and food?
We have to. I mean, I think it is massively underestimated at the moment as to the situation in Ukraine that is developing. I mean, it is going to create a global humanitarian crisis that we won't have witnessed before. It'll probably make the Arab Spring look extremely mild unless the world acts. And understanding effectively the timelines of conception and growing, you can't flick a switch. You have to plan 6 to 12 months ahead in order to fill that gap. So we have to do that. We have the situation, Egypt will be the most important discussion on climate change that the world has had, and it will be the most important discussion. And it's quite an irony that that conversation will be taking place in Egypt, and it will focus the world's attention on how we tackle it. And I mean, I should have been in Budapest today at the World Farmers Organization General Assembly, where you have the African subsistence farmers, the Americans, the Europeans, the Australians, the New Zealanders. There is a real desire at a farmed level to change things, and we have to bring everybody effectively into the room through those representative organizations, because as I said, we have to deal with all of these things. And the danger is, we deal with energy over there, we deal with nature over there. We don't even deal with food at the moment. We have an energy strategy. We don't have a food strategy. That's due out at the end of June. So we have to deal with all of them together. And the pressures are enormous now. But, there is I think the opportunity, and, within a farm landscape, nature is everywhere. I think we tend to think nature is something that, what is it? What does it look like? And then, we tend to just think of trees, biodiversity, nature is embedded in our landscapes, and we have to do all of it together. And I think that's the exciting thing, and that was why the NFU laid down the gauntlet in 2019, that we could beat the government target by 10 years with the right policies, the right incentives to get there. Because we know there's no silver bullet. There are a variety of bullets that effectively will be the new innovations, the new techs, married with practices of the past as well. So, the pressure is on, but the good thing about the pressure being on is that will focus hearts and minds, because they are going to be forced into focusing now. And it's a situation that 12 months ago, 6 months ago, 4 months ago, nobody would have told you the world was facing into this. Now, the energy situation is flashing red. I'm amazed that the food situation isn't flashing red, because it should be. They are one and the same thing. We have to deal with both of them. And those innovations that I talked about that weren't available to us 10, 15, 20 years ago, they're coming online now. And this is where the UK has a real chance to lead in effectively the economic recovery and ambition for delivering net zero. And, you know, for my sector, nature, you know, we are an emitter, we're 10% of emissions, but we also are a sink. So, you know, that is a fabulous opportunity for this country, but we have to look at through the lens of economics in order to get to that place for nature.
Thank you. Anna, just coming to yourself, where, you know, how have you captured hearts and minds within Estée Lauder to make nature something that's intrinsic to your boardroom discussions, but also the way that you operate as a business? Because many people wouldn't think of, you know, Estée having a nature strategy. Mm-hmm. So just talk us through that, and also for those across the business community here today, how does that filter down through so that it's not just at an executive level? Because something that we've heard about across the conference, a lot of questions have been about community engagement, it's been about employee engagement as well. There's no point having a strategy set at the top if it's not completely embedded throughout the organisation.
Mm-hmm. Just really interested in I'm always fascinated looking who the speaker lineup is, and at one moment sort of thinking, oh God, we're all so different and we're so diverse. And then there's always just so much reassurance in the commonalities between, you know, however differently we come at things. And my team knows one of the things I'll most commonly hear from me is I'm always talking about connect the dots. And, you know, we can often see the dots. A lot of what you're speaking about is you know, how do we navigate all of these things at the moment and the changing priorities and these geopolitical forces that we could never have predicted even as recently as 6 months ago. And so it's never losing sight of those dots and connecting them constantly. And you may draw a different picture out of it, but we constantly come back to that metaphor of just keeping them connected and looking at them. The other thing that I constantly, within a business environment and coming at it from a sustainability perspective, something that I'm always reminding myself and my team of is speak the language of the business. You know, when the board is meeting, when the senior executive leadership teams are meeting and they're having to navigate these new geopolitical headwinds, when they're thinking about the urgency of how do they figure out complex supply chains and all of the issues that are emerging there, I could look pretty silly going in and saying, now let's talk about nature. So it's always converting. It's sometimes like speaking another language, and I go into that language mode, and I know that we have to speak differently and look for different ways to resonate with what they're looking for and make the business case. So it's a lot about translation. It's a lot about connecting the dots. But I'm very fortunate that the environment within which I can do that is incredibly positive and conducive to that within the Estée Lauder companies. So a little bit about our structure, first of all. When I say we, I only work for the UK arm of it. It's actually a 75-year-old company, American-owned, headquartered out of New York. About 46,000 employees globally and present in about 150 different markets and territories. So we are the corporate brand behind it. My representation is for the Estée Lauder companies, but the public manifestation, the way that it shows up to the consumers, is through our 25-plus consumer brands, amongst them brands that you'll be familiar with, such as MAC, Estée Lauder, Clinique, Jo Malone, London. So there's a lot of levers that we can pull on at any given time. And so the simplest way to express what we do and where we're doing it is that we're using the corporate brand as the 26th brand, as you will, as well as pulling the levers across the other 25 consumer-facing brands at any time. And all of them are active and have been for many decades across both environmental and social positive impact. So we all do different things, but it's all pulled together under one very, very clear and well-articulated strategy, which sits under the governance and oversight of our board, who have stood up an ESG committee. So everything ultimately is under their oversight, reports into them, and then there is a whole cadence of accountability and goal setting amongst that. So just following that line through for one moment, if we will. The most senior executives in our company are compensated against sustainability goals. Their performance is measured against that. There's a whole raft of other business strategy goals that are obviously part of their focus, but sustainability is absolutely baked into those goals that they are held accountable for. If you look beyond that level of senior leadership, of our 46,000 employees around the world, they are all tasked with sustainability. We call it mainstreaming sustainability. So that might show up very differently in people's roles. If you are the head of packaging innovation, it's going to look very different from if you are doing an 8-hour shift part-time on the Clinique counter at John Lewis. But we are very clear and very granular about what part you can play within this global corporate mission. And I think that really helps, is to break it down and to make it personal, so it never seems too abstract or remote, depending on where you sit in the business. But obviously you need some tools to be able to do that. You can't just be told what you should be doing, you need to know how you should do it. And so that's backed up with a digital interactive learning guide that we provide. So that's ongoing, updated. It provides the insights and skills and information that we believe our colleagues need in order to understand what changes they need to make, what progress they can make in social and environmental impact. We go a little bit beyond that. I'm sort of keeping my eye on the clock, but it can even be as practical as providing volunteering time off. So we've long had a program of giving employees time away from the office where they can go, or away from retail counters, where they can go and invest their personal time in the projects that matter most to them. They don't even have to be aligned with the companies. Ideally they would be, because then I think there's strength in numbers, but it's really about unlocking your own personal passion, because then you'll get absolute conviction and drive and energy behind what somebody does. But we've just recently set up a whole hundreds of days of volunteering in nature. CBI were very good about coming along and volunteering with us. But what that does is it gets the staff out. It gets them getting their hands dirty. Now, it might be a pretty blunt instrument. We're not claiming to change the world. But what it does is give them a personal, practical, immersive experience in being able to put into practice our theoretical commitment of we need to look at nature and understand what we can do there. If I can give you a brand example, Joe Malone London have invested over 1.5 million across the last 10 years in creating charitable gardens in quite key city urban areas where there may not be that much green space, and their primary motivation for doing that way back was looking at the restorative nature, the restorative effect of nature on mental health and well-being. And they were seeking to break down the stigmas attached to mental illness. And where that has now evolved to is that they're still doing that, but they're also have now the more recognized benefit alongside that of actually those help to actually bolster the local communities where those gardens are. So just coming at it from the top down all the way through, from side to side of the business, everybody tasked, understanding what their role within it is, and from brand as well as to corporation. That's our approach.
Brilliant. I'm just going to give 5 minutes of warning that I'll be coming out to questions to the audience, so start getting them ready. Richard, just coming back to yourself on that same question, 2030 isn't that far away. So how do you keep the mind focused within an organisation around this point of delivery?
I think the 2030 and the net zero is actually something that isn't that hard for us to conceptualize in a business. And I don't want to be flippant about it. It's a lot of work goes into it, but it's in the sector that we're in, we have to rely on the environment. So I don't want to be glib about it, but it's slightly different. So our raw product comes from the environment. Ultimately, we give back to the environment. So it's sort of core. It's something that has to be absolutely core to what we do. We use that to our advantage to really engage with our people. We do a lot of things that have been just said. So we have a Just an Hour program. We get typically over 50% of people doing charitable work out in the communities, out in the environment. We've got hundreds out doing beach cleans today because it's World Ocean Day. So those kind of things we've got a real success and track record in getting people engaged with. So I think from our point of view, getting the hearts and minds of employees isn't something we've struggled with. I think we've got them really behind us. As for, I suppose, 2030, 2027, whichever the target is in which company, it's just something there's a real focus on as a sector. So it's multifaceted. There's different strands. So as I've mentioned before, I'll not repeat them all, but lots of strands from renewable energy, things like in Northumbrian water, just thinking back to the energy purchase. So the energy that we do purchase, because we have to, we purchase energy that's from a good source and and that helps us, if you like. So there's pure things you can do, and then there's these kind of offsetting type things I suppose you can do as well. So lots of things from our perspective. I think another thing we've done in the water sector, we've done Northumbrian, is we have got a natural capital account for our land holding. So that's something we talked about and mulled about for a while, but then put the effort in to actually get that. And what that does is give us a baseline, something to work from. So we now know, for good or for bad, because it might not be the same way another company might do a natural capital account. We're clear what our baseline is to work from. So again, that's really valuable. Having put that plunge in, that was reported back to the board, picking up some of the governance things. Another thing that really helps us from a board point of view is we've got a really good non-exec who has a particular role around nature and environment. So them and Jackie McGlade from UCL, and Jackie absolutely keeps and shines the light on that and doesn't allow the light to go off it. So that's really good. Because that, if there was ever any doubt, it's always on the agenda from that person who has a specific role to keep it on the agenda. So just a few builds.
And Andrea, coming to yourself, Minette talked about some of the opportunities that the UK has here when it comes to nature and biodiversity. Listening to Anna and Richard, these are some examples where the UK is really excelling. We've obviously also had the Environment Act. We've got, a great history as well of creating good policy. But to anyone that asks the question, what do you think we are good at when you go into those international conversations? And a challenge to those of us from the business community, where can business be leaning in more?
So the two different questions. So what are we doing really well, I guess? The natural capital accounting, I think, and the work that has been done in the UK on natural capital accounting, I think, is really is good and is cutting edge. And there are others that want to learn from us on that. And there's a lot of kind of technical assistance around that. Some of the work that is starting in this country on investing and creating kind of nature markets is also pretty world leading. And so that comes from organisations like the Environment Bank. Tridos Bank are doing some really interesting work with Esme Fairburn and the Environment Agency, which is basically looking at how, in addition to the public subsidy, so essentially in addition to the public money that will be going to farmers to help encourage environmental outcomes, there are also markets that can be created, either working with water companies and looking to see what an ongoing kind of revenue stream could be. And some of the work going on in the UK on that is really cutting edge and I think is advanced in other places. And I do think from our NDC and the way in which we've got now a strong legal framework, not only through the Climate Change Act, but also a legal framework through the Environment Act, I think those are also things that other countries are keen to talk to us about and keen to understand how you bake essentially some of the political ambition in through the system and get the regulatory framework, particularly on disclosure, baked in. So we've obviously got mandatory disclosure around carbon and climate, but there's a very active involvement from the UK government on TNFD, which David Craig will have talked to you about. And again, that's seen to be the UK expertise, not only our private sector expertise, but our scientific expertise that's been kind of driving a lot of that. So I think that's a lot of where we are seen to be kind of leading globally, I think, on the nature and climate intersection. In terms of the role for business, if I think back to 2015 when I was still working on climate and was, again, in the Department for International Development at that point, and I think about what happened in 2015, there were these massive winds of change. Essentially, you need the market to move slightly ahead of government because government doesn't want to take a risk too far ahead. So it needs to hear very strong signals from business, both about the fact that it has spotted that nature is an existential risk to business models and is an existential risk to whether it's water scarcity or whether it's just not knowing what the risk is around your deforestation and your supply chains. Businesses need to be articulating that and saying that they're worried about managing those risks, and also the the interest in investing in really high integrity carbon markets, which means thinking about the biodiversity outcomes and the outcomes for Indigenous groups. And once you've got that kind of that demand, I think it is then much easier to get a political resolution and much easier to bake that in politically through a political settlement, which is, you know, what my team is doing. But you can't do that in isolation if it looks like you're way ahead of where the market is, where the opportunities are, and where the acknowledgement is of the risk. So we need to hear from business really strongly. We need to kind of keep the engagement going with business. And I think that's a conversation certainly I was having in Stockholm last week at Stockholm Plus 50, which was 50 years since the first UN Environment Conference. There was a massive focus on food security. It was the core theme going through it all, looking at climate, biodiversity and pollution as the three critical kind of environmental challenges, and it all coming together in food and food security, food production. So it's absolutely central to all the conversations that I'm having at the moment, is how biodiversity and nature is absolutely fundamental to health, to economic food security. And the more that businesses can articulate from their own perspective, I think, how they've also see nature as this kind of existential risk and opportunity, I think we can then all co-create and get to some right outcomes and understand what kind of enabling frameworks we need to put in place.
It's great hearing it from sort of the other side of the fence, as it were, because, you know, I'm sitting on the side of business, and, you know, we welcome and we find it really positive, all of the pledges that have been made and the very clear action that's been set out by the government. I think we're very fortunate in the UK that there is a clearer vision here than perhaps in some other areas around the world, and the government is clear about what climate strategy we have and what ambition we have for nature as well. But I think what there is sitting behind that is the very sobering research from WWF that's showing that in order to meet those ambitions in the next 10 years, there's actually a £56 billion shortfall in funding. And to Manette's point, you know, that's going to come from public and private partnerships. We have to unlock private capital, which can come from business if they can find the right solutions. And then you get to gather that momentum and you get to connect those dots, or you see the signals that can actually bring in force all of those other agents of change and government agents in order to bring in the legislation and so forth. So we welcome the framework of TCFD. We welcome the framework of the task force on nature-based reporting as well. And those things can help us frame better, measure better, be more robust, which can help us in turn unlock further capital from our businesses to invest in these solutions. So just one example of how we've started to do that in the UK is around an initiative that we were proud to be a founding partner of last year, which launched, and it's called Revere. And what Revere does is it's a partnership between Palladium and the national parks of the UK. And it essentially backs and provides seed funding for innovative, new, scalable, nature-based solutions. So it's very nascent. It doesn't have all of the answers. We don't yet know what it's going to do. The whole point of it was, it's a test and learn. It's that we know the overall concept. We're confident enough that the answers lie in nature-based solutions. They are concentrating the work that they are doing around peatland conservation, forest creation, flood resistance measures, and also around the protection of iconic species. And so they're looking to scale that, to learn from it, and then to make it available so it can be scaled further across the UK. And what we were was a kind of a wedge that can drive further. They were looking for pioneering beacon brands, beacon lights from the corporate world that could back this. So it was a struggle for us internally, us being the ESG department, to have that conversation with the decision makers, with senior leadership, because you're very rarely going to be able to provide the level of answers that they want, the quantifiable measures that they want. Yeah. But as Javier was saying earlier, you've got to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that's something that my boss says as well. You can get to a point of just enough certainty that you're satisfied it's the right thing to do, and then you've just got to go for it and be prepared to learn from it. So we really hope that the results, the insights from that project are going to be something that can benefit many, many more businesses and ultimately benefit the nature and restoration of biodiversity, meeting the 2030 goals for the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Andrea, to your point, let's go out to questions. So the challenge to the audience to show Andrea that actually nature is top priority. So we've got some roving mics. I see one question over here and one down below at the front. So we'll take them together or in pairs. So gentleman at the back.
Thanks. Alex Hugh from University of Exeter. I think Andrea said that the UK is really leading in natural capital and ecosystem service markets, which I think we really are. We've got a huge opportunity with agricultural reform to address many years of what the Common Agricultural Policy has perhaps not done so well in the UK. But we haven't heard much about the UK's biodiversity nature impacts at a global level. We can save a tonne of carbon, and it doesn't matter where that tonne of carbon is, but our biodiversity impacts are incredibly spatially explicit. Where Estee Lauder's buying products and having water impacts and things, we're having huge impacts in certain places around the world. So I just welcome the panel's reflections on the UK's impact on nature at a global level.
Thank you. And this question here.
Thank you. Marcus Watson. I'm an investor in a number of sustainable businesses. And I'm struck by the fact that we have a very finite resource in land base, and that land is actually going to decrease as the temperature increases, both through land being uninhabitable in parts of the world, and sea levels rising is going to reduce the area available anyhow. So we've got three key demands on the land. We need to feed people, we need to plant trees to be a carbon sink, and we need to rewild. And one of the industries that's actually super land intensive is the production of animal protein for human consumption. And so my question is around how and we're seeing a huge drive from the consumer that says, I want to be vegetarian, I want to be vegan, I want to have a better impact a lower impact on the environment through my dietary choices. And so my question is, I guess to DEFRA and the NFU, what is your role in cajoling, encouraging, nudging people to adopt a more plant-based diet to free up some of the land for the other things that are needed in achieving net zero?
Thank you. And one question at the back as well.
Hello, Aude Thibault from the Innovation Fund. You've mentioned some of the barriers standing in the way of nature positivity, financing, economic incentives, but can you comment a little bit on perhaps the people skills and competencies that are maybe missing or lacking or needing development to reach these goals? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So 3 very different questions there. We've got sort of just under 10 minutes, so I'll let each of the panellists sort of come on a variety of the questions. Minette, if it's all right to start with yourself, just thinking about something that we discussed before the panel is also, the competing priorities on land, but also thinking about behavioural changes across industry, across society. So just picking up on a couple of those questions, if you give your reflections on those.
Yeah, I think your question sort of sums up one of the challenges that I face into on a daily basis, and something that society is enormously confused and conflicted about. And we immediately, whether we're Nigel Farage or anybody, we immediately delve into trees for carbon. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Trees, yes, good, but grassland actually doing a much better job. So the woody biomass in trees, if you look at the Wakehurst project at Kew, the Royal Botanical Gardens, that is about 17% in woody biomass and about 6% in roots in the tree structure. In the grassland structure, you've got over 70% of your embedded carbon, and they are looking at the value of the mycorrhizal fungi. So don't get into the space where trees do everything. Trees have a part to play. They don't actually do as much as hedges either. So they have a part to play. And then we get into livestock. And there are many places in the world where we shouldn't actually be producing livestock. But there are many places that we should. And the UK has a temperate climate, and it grows grass, and we should be producing livestock here in an extensive system, which is what we are doing. And the other big mistake in all of this is when we think that plant-based means you can just leave the soil and stuff will grow. Wrong. You have to continually invest in your soil. You have to continually build your organic matter. Nitrogen fertilizer keeps 4 billion people alive on this planet. Now, that is not the long-term future. We are going to have to change, and new technology is going to help that. But actually, what we need is more grasslands. What we need is more organic manure. What we need is not just putting our food waste into landfill. We need to be composting it, and we need to be investing it in our soil health. So this argument is really, really flawed, and it doesn't deal with the wider argument. It is just, sadly, not as simple as go to plant-based, stop animal-based, and you will sort the problem. My goodness, you don't. But we've got to be really selective about where we are doing it. We never talk about water. Water scarcity is the greatest challenge this world faces. And we're quite reliant on Spain for everything. And everybody will keep saying, oh, Spain will keep producing it. Spain can't keep producing it. The UK has got to take greater level of ownership. So, you know, bring on this food strategy, because hopefully it will join up all the dots that you refer to deal with this problem. But we have to, and I keep on saying it, we have to do it all together. And it is much, much more complicated than trees. And one more very quick thing, you know, we're talking, and we're so excited about the carbon market. What we have to have is a baseline analysis. What ideally DEFRA would do with the SFI and join it up across government is to say, right, these are the soil analysis that we want. And this is one tool we're going to use to measure it, because we have no idea what is going on out there. So everybody's excited about the carbon market. You've got no idea what it actually looks like. We need to know the baseline of those measurements, and we need one tool to measure it. And then we can start to develop a common currency. And then we can start to lead the discussions globally on what a common currency could look like. Because the bottom line with nature is you've got to get the money, and it's great Joe Malone are doing stuff in cities, but we want to get stuff right across the countryside. 75% of the country is rural. Let's start utilizing it and investing in it, and then we'll deliver for nature. But please, let's try and bring it not into plant versus animal. Sorry, you can tell I talk about that a lot.
Do you want me to take all three? Yeah.
A lot of them are horticultural members who are growing all those plants. And I tell you, they're the most upset ones at the moment because they don't have access to the things that they need. We've got glass houses being mothballed. I represent all farmers, and I want to see us all eating more fruit and vegetables. Let's be clear on that. More pulses, more fruit and vegetables, but let's demonize one sector against the other. We need all of them. We should be really proud that we have a great climate in the UK to produce that sort of food.
Andrea.
Brilliant, yeah. So I guess taking the three questions in turn. So the first one, I think you're completely right. The risk that we put in very strong regulation in the UK and that we just offshore all our carbon and our biodiversity impacts, I think is a very real one. And so the Environment Act legislated in two areas. The first one was around due diligence, which was in particular putting in much stronger measures around knowing what our supply chains look like. We started with timber, and there was a consultation recently basically looking at additional commodities that could be added to that. So that would include maize, soybean, palm oil. And that's basically then about looking at the UK supply chains, basically where are we driving deforestation through our supply chains in what we're buying and where you put in due diligence, so basically transparency commitments. And the second thing was looking at a global footprint indicator for the UK. So that work is underway and was something that was part of the Environment Act. I think the second question then, in relation to shifting to a kind of more plant-based diet, I mean, I think, Minette is correct that if you go to, the showcase of kind of rewilding projects at NEP, or you go to Holcombe, and they're all about integrated systems where actually you really need animals to be grazing, you really need animals in the system in order to actually get the highest quality biodiversity and nature outcomes on those landscapes. So this is about kind of doing the right thing in the right places that helps you restore and get the right outcomes. And I don't think it's as easy as you must all turn it into this or you turn it into that. I think it's about balance. And there's a very live debate at the moment in the Russia-Ukraine context, I think, on things like biofuels, on things like production, use of land to produce food for animals, and what is the best use of particularly scarce resources. So a greater focus on agri-tech, I think, and a greater focus on productivity, and a greater use on how you can get win-wins on land, rather than thinking it's either for food or it's for kind of environmental outcomes, and how you get those win-wins. And then I think on the kind of third question really about people skills and capability, I think the biggest thing that I hear is that there's a lot of capital that wants to be invested, particularly in developing countries, as part of carbon offsets, but also because people want to invest because it's a corporate social responsibility. So there is capital out there, but at the moment there isn't a project pipeline coming through. So many of the countries, there isn't enough capability to put together basically a project design. There isn't enough capability to say, we've got all this amazing natural capital, whether it's in the tropical forest or it's mangroves or it's your kind of savanna, and there's something about how the work needs to be done at a technical level on mapping that, doing the natural capital accounting, and then thinking how you then bake that into your national level plans, and then how you present that basically as a project pipeline that then you can either take into a kind of a multilateral forum, or you can get a bilateral donor, or you can take into the private market and you'll get a revenue stream for. But the packaging, I think, and the understanding of what asset people have got in their country as a natural capital, I just don't think that kind of capability is the one that we see as the major kind of constraint and blocker, I think. We have a massive capability in our Indigenous communities, and the billions of people that are reliant, and you get the best, I think, knowledge and understanding in those Indigenous communities about how to manage and restore and look after the land to get the highest quality biodiversity outcomes. And I think there's something also about how we listen to those Indigenous communities, how we give them a voice, how we give them a platform, and integrate them into some of the decision making that's happening both nationally and internationally, to kind of learn from that expertise, which I think is what's happening actually in this country. And the best examples, it's people who've often invested in the land long term, who've been on there for a long time, who've invested in it for the many generations in the future, who then are really bought in and understand which fields you can do what with, because they know the weather, they know the climate patterns. And it's exactly the same in developing countries. It's people who've lived there for generations who know best, and we just need to think about how you kind of harness that and understand and listen to that. So I think they're the biggest.
I know we're running out of time, but there's just things that both Andrea and Minette said that really resonated for me and for some of the work that we're doing. Firstly, with Andrea's reference to some of the Indigenous communities and how that is a powerful unlock. And we're seeing that in a program that we've recently launched between Conservation International and the Amazon Indigenous Women's Fellowship Program, where we are working with 6 women fellows across Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and other Amazonian geographies, where we're helping use their innate skills and their local understanding, as well as providing the funding for expertise over and above that. And with the goal of the outcome that we have set is that that's going to enable 550,000 hectares of irreplaceable high carbon forests to be delivered, and the sequestering of over 20 million tons of irrecoverable carbon. So I do think that there's something in that. That's just one example that many, many companies are doing around the world. I've got to give a shout out to what some of our industry is doing in fashion and beauty. The Caring company is absolutely hats off to them. They have actually published publicly their biodiversity strategy. It's very well thought out, extremely well articulated, and they're doing a lot of open sourcing off the back of it. To Minette's point, great that you picked up on what one of our brands, Jo Malone, is doing in cities, but I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you. It has to be beyond that. And so that's why Revere is such a passion project for me and for the company, because that's working with the 15 national parks all across the UK, and it's looking at new solutions and those that work, and it's being prepared to test new things and to discover those complications and complexities that you're referring to.
Richard, I'll give you the last sort of 60 seconds or so to give your response to all of those 3 questions. But in particular, looking at sort of the skills piece as well would be really interesting.
I think on the skills piece, I would appreciate the points that were added from a financial perspective. I think really getting down to the basics of partnerships, being able to build relationships, build trust, because nature-based solutions don't happen unless you can do that. So being able to be in a position where you can successfully, and it's not easy, build trust, build relationships, and deliver on everybody's outcomes. Got some real good examples in the Northeast where we've done this with something called the Northumbrian Integrated Drainage Partnership around flooding, and it took us a few years to get moving on it, but we really clicked. And once we did click, and we realised what was in it for everybody, we've delivered some brilliant nature-based schemes up in the Northeast to prevent flooding. I'm sure we can do absolutely the same from a nature perspective.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, I would like to say thank you very much to our esteemed panel for this great session. We started off the conference yesterday talking about the geopolitical context that we are in, and hopefully you've taken away that this focused discussion today on nature biodiversity is going to be the next biggest issue that we are all going to face across the room. But we also spoke yesterday about the green growth opportunity, and I think we've seen here across the panelists today that there is a huge opportunity here for us in the UK, not only domestically but internationally. So what I've taken away is, we need to connect the dots across all of us in this room and actually take that to government so that we put that up the priority list and actually achieve what we have done on net zero and see this sort of integrated with nature and biodiversity, and look forward to participating and contributing to things like COP15, but also COP27, where nature loss and damage is going to be a huge priority issue for the Egyptian presidency as well, and so it rightly should be. So can I say thank you once again to Anna, to Minette, to Andrea and Richard for this great panel, and let's give them a round of applause.
Well, look, Tanya, Anna, Andrea, Minette, Richard, thank you. Not just a brilliant panel to conclude the day, but also a really, really important piece of the jigsaw. So thank you an awful lot for that. Look, as you can see, we're almost there. We're on our final set rejig of the conference, and we'll be up and running in just a moment with our President, Lord Karen Birmoria, to conclude and close. Karen, I'm sure you were going to say this anyway, but just from me as my final appearance on the stage, just huge personal thanks to a few folk. One to our sponsors who have just made this entire conference possible: Bain, Equinor, National Grid, all the others, you know who you are. Thanks also to the CBI home team. You mentioned Tanya earlier, but we've just had a brilliant collaborative effort between our commercial, our campaigns, our comms, my own teams in the policy part of the business to make this conference possible, and in particular Leanne and Ed, who've been magically pulling the strings at the back there to make it all work seamlessly. So huge thanks to all of you. And lastly, before I hand on to Karen, huge thanks to all of you in the audience. We say an awful lot at the CBI, just your insights, your anecdotes, your challenge. It makes my job, our job, not just easier, but possible. So thank you for that. And please welcome to the stage your President, Lord Cullen Birmoria, for closing remarks. Karen.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This is actually, look at this. This is CBI efficiency at its best. We are running ahead of time. And so it's my great honor and my great pleasure to conclude the conference. Now, this is all being recorded, and it's going to be up on our website, so I have to make a formal closing. But just before I make those final remarks, I just want to say to me personally, when I came in as Vice President, you come in for a year as President-elect. This was in 2019, in June, and I was appointed to take over in 2020. Now, of course, the first thing was, what are my priorities going to be? So I listed my priorities. And said, oh, by the way, you're Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. We just happened to form this heat commission, and with one of your senior professors, Professor Martin Freer, would you be willing to chair this heat commission? It's serendipity that you're coming in as president, and we're doing this work with the University of Birmingham. And so I chaired the heat commission. And I remember Kwasi Kwarteng, who was a very good friend of mine, going back many years. He was the energy minister at the time. And we engaged with him through this heat commission report. And as we progressed through this heat commission, I realized how absolutely urgent and crucial the challenge was going to be. And I said, whatever my priorities are as president of CBI, this is going to be a priority for me. This whole area of decarbonization, of getting to net zero, is going to be absolutely crucial to me. I mean, the statistics, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions coming from heat, half of that coming from buildings, 29 million homes in this country, and only 1 million of them, as we speak, are up to the standard if we're going to reach net zero by 2050. And so this report actually went about outlining what we need to do to get our houses, those 28 million houses, to upgrade them to be able to get to net zero by 2050. And we suggested a center for the decarbonization of heat. We estimated at least 250,000 new jobs, and of course a huge amount of money in terms of investment. And at that stage it was heat pumps, it was community heating, and also we started talking about hydrogen. And look how quickly the world moves, that after we put that report in, Kwasi was delighted, and we then had the government heat strategy that came out, and a lot of it was taken from our report. And look at the serendipity of it all. Kwasi then becomes the business minister, and business secretary of state for business. And his acronym he said, this sums up what I believe in and what my objective as Secretary of State for Business is ENZI, Enterprise, Net Zero, and Innovation. And so he's been a real champion for what we've been doing. And look at the serendipity of everything today, as I'm speaking to you now, as I close this conference. We've had a University of Birmingham Heat Commission report about the decarbonization of homes. I don't know how many of you, any hands, anyone seen that report or heard about its announcement today? Can I just see? Well, look out for it, because it builds on what I started working on going back to 2019, 3 years ago, with regard to the decarbonization of heat. Here's another bit of serendipity. Her Majesty the Queen, every couple of years, gives out a Queen's Award to just 20 higher education and some further education institutions. And you get a Queen's Award for your university for a particular department. And I was the youngest university chancellor in the country for 5 years of what is now the University of West London. We were very lucky to have received a Queen's Award when I was chancellor then. And then during my 8 years as chancellor of the University of Birmingham, we received a Queen's Award a few years ago for our railway department. We have one of the finest railway departments, I'm not exaggerating, in the world. We work with the Indian Railways, one of the largest railways in the world. And Professor Clive Roberts, the professor in charge, who's now head of our engineering department, is a guru on the world stage when it comes to railways. And when we were at Buckingham Palace and Prince Charles was walking around congratulating the winners, and when he came to us, we were talking, and Professor Clive Roberts said, oh, and by the way, Your Royal Highness, we're developing a hydrogen-powered train. And I joked, and I said to him, well, Your Royal Highness, it's only a matter of time before the royal train is powered by hydrogen. And we all laughed. Okay? We all laughed. And what happened? Fast forward to COP26 in November last year. And there we had the world's first retrofitted hydrogen-powered train, Hydroflex, developed by the University of Birmingham. It started off as a PhD project 10 years ago into a model hydrogen train called Hydrogen Hero in the department to an actual functioning hydrogen-powered train. And wait for this, Prince Charles was on board that train. And thank you very much. And also, Prince Charles was on board the train Boris Johnson was on board the train, and I had the privilege of chairing a meeting of transport leaders on board that moving train. So that's a little bit of backdrop. And now I'm going to be breaking a world record. You can set your watches. I'm going to be summarizing 2 days of an amazing packed agenda of panels and speakers and interviews summarized in 20 minutes. Okay? And the clock starts now. We brought together leaders in business, academia, political parties of all stripes, and the message is clear. We're all unanimously united in the need to drive forward the decarbonization agenda. This is a crucial time for the net zero agenda. It's just over 6 months since the UK hosted the UN Climate Change Conference COP26. I was present for 1.5 out of the 2 weeks. The conference brought together, as usual, NGOs, as usual, governments. But, and this is the big but, this time at COP26, business was there in force, on force, bigger, better, more than ever, all committed to tackling climate change. But, another but, what has happened in the 6 months since COP26? We've had a whole host of new challenges, soaring energy prices, rampant inflation, officially reaching 9%, but much higher than that in most cases, the highest inflation for 40 years. These pressures, exacerbated by the tragic war in Ukraine, have created a genuine cost of living crisis that is squeezing both businesses and consumers. So now, there are some who are saying that net zero is a costly distraction or even an expense that's contributing to this crisis. But in fact, exactly the opposite is true. And as we've heard over the past 2 days, net zero isn't part of the problem, it's part of the solution. So government has rightly taken action, or trying to take action, to help those who are suffering real hardship because of the cost of living crisis, the £37 billion for consumers, no help for business yet. But we also need to grow through this. And to prevent further economic downturns, we need to get long-term sustainable growth in the pipeline now. And decarbonization is a huge opportunity. And there's already a wall of investment. We heard at COP26, $130 trillion of assets there ready to finance. So to seize these opportunities, we must invest in research and development innovation, in green growth, in green finance, in the green industrial revolution. And that's why we back the government's big bets on nuclear, including small nuclear reactors. And I've just been informed from one of the authorities in the nuclear industry in this country at a CBI roundtable that I chaired recently that we can build these small modular reactors within the next 5 years. And each one of them has the ability to power a city the size of Sheffield. We can partner with countries like India, the country I was born in, where they are champions of solar power. And we're really, really delighted the government is taking this seriously with its energy security strategy published, its hydrogen investment roadmap to capitalize on this vital power source. I believe hydrogen is the future. And even before the government's investment roadmap, business has already been taking the lead in hydrogen. 2 CBI members, Cadent and Equinor, are working together on a project to use hydrogen to heat homes in the East Midlands and the Northeast. And one of them has told me it is quite possible in the next decade we could have these 29 million homes I spoke about being powered by green hydrogen to heat the homes. Can you imagine that? Totally clean, zero emissions. It's a dream, but that dream is within touching distance. And as the proud Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, as I've just told you, at COP26, I was so proud of Hydroflex, the world's first retrofitted hydrogen-powered train, up and running. And I want to make this point again. Designed by a university, the University of Birmingham, with a consortium of businesses and backed by the UK government, by Innovate UK. So that is the power of government, universities and businesses working together. And the Heat Commission was another example of government and CBI, businesses, universities working together, and of course today's Pathways for Local Heat Delivery report. So I don't want to miss this out, and maybe we haven't covered it enough in this conference, but the circular economy is also very much part of the solution. And in my own industry with Cobra Beer, for example, we do our very best. The malt that is used to brew the beer, the waste malt, is used for cattle feed. The yeast that we use to ferment the beer The waste yeast is used to make Marmite. We use as little water as possible. Whatever water is wasted is treated through an effluent plant, and that water can be reused. And even carbon dioxide can be captured and reused. That's the circular economy in action. And I think the UK should continue to be a world leader in net zero. We need to lead the way as global exporters of green products and services and as the global headquarters for green finance. And in the last 2 years of my presidency of CBI, I have traveled the country and the world representing and promoting and championing our country's green expertise. So it's been inspirational for me to see that expertise being demonstrated and marshaled in such force at the CBI's Achieving Net Zero conference. Tony Danker, our outstanding Director General, I keep saying new Director General. He's been there for 1.5 years now. So he's almost 1/3 of the way through his tenure. Time flies. And we kicked off yesterday with a really powerful talk from Tony, describing the huge challenges that have arisen since COP26, as I said earlier, inflation, cost of living, tragic war in Ukraine, that threaten the net zero agenda. Members of ours and focus groups have asked us, should we be putting decarbonization on hold for now with all these crises? But we can't. And Tony showed that decarbonization is the solution, not the problem, for 2 reasons. Firstly, he said, the war in Ukraine smashed the paradigm that depended on pockets of energy concentrated in the hands of people we can no longer trust or depend upon. We must go green to get people's energy bills down, and as he put it, we need a new normal of energy efficiency, not a new normal of billion-pound bailouts every quarter. Second, decarbonization is a growth opportunity worth billions of pounds to the UK economy, and he said decarbonization is not about woke, it's about wealth. And he said if your strategy isn't fit for a net zero world, your strategy will fail. So really powerful stuff. Next, we had a fantastic panel digging deeper into how the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine are affecting the race to net zero. We heard that although we're in a better position than many countries across Europe, because we import just between 4 and 6% of gas from Russia, we must accelerate towards a net zero with a laser focus on energy resilience. And our panelists agreed that we're now entering a new stage in our drive for decarbonization when we must learn as we go rapidly, delivering new technologies rapidly. Because as John Pettigrew, the chief executive of the National Grid, emphasized, to be resilient, we must not rely on just one technology, we need a mix of technologies. And Bernice Lee, chair of the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator Advisory Board, said, for some of those technologies, we will need to collaborate across borders, because if the UK, we can't produce it all ourselves. So we need to think about strategic partners for key technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, so that CCUS collaboration is key. Net zero is nothing if not international. And I've seen this through the pandemic. Look at the collaboration around the world during the pandemic. Oxford AstraZeneca developing the vaccine, AstraZeneca, Swedish-British company headquartered in Cambridge, collaborating with the Serum Institute of India, the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world before the pandemic in Pune in India. They have produced 2 billion doses of the vaccine. Cross-border collaboration, saving lives around the world. Next, we heard about the scale of green growth opportunity and its power to create almost 2 million jobs at a conservative estimate in this country by 2030. And we heard from Julian Critchlow, the advisory partner at Bain, about the massive first-mover advantages in green growth. And as he put it, we need to do what we did with the Industrial Revolution and lead from the front. Isn't it amazing, this tiny country, 1% of the world's population? Look back historically how every single time we lead from the front. We are the creators. We are the innovators. We've done that historically. We can do it again. And we have the power to lead here. As Olar Najari, the founder and CEO of British Volt, and I was there at his launch with his partnership with Indonesia, we have the national treasure, lithium-ion batteries, combine that with our world-leading universities and research capabilities, and we are sat at the epicenter of growth. The panel shone a light on some of the most exciting areas where we can seize the opportunity too, from carbon capture and storage and financial products to data collection to vertical farming and the Teslafication of food production. Our next panel explored some of the biggest international opportunities for green growth. For example, we heard from the Department of International Trade, the DIT's Director General for Exports and UK Trade, Andrew Mitchell, who I've worked very closely with over the years with our trade deals, which I'll come to, that the global market for low-carbon exports is ever growing and set to reach £2 trillion by 2030. So apart from rolling over 66 EU bilateral trade agreements in time in the transition period, which we played a major role in the CBI helping that make that happen, we've also signed new trade agreements. And I and the CBI have been at the table for these trade agreements, helping to close them, whether it's Australia, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's the India Free Trade Agreement, which is being negotiated as we speak. And we've launched, I went to India just recently and launched the UK-India Industry Task Force with the CBI and the CII, our counterparts in India, to help with the trade deal. And the New Zealand trade deal, for example, now includes comprehensive lists of environmental goods with liberalized tariffs. So net zero is also at the heart of trade agreements. More than ever, green growth is going global. So while much of our conference has focused on the scale of the opportunities, our lunchtime panel yesterday, led by the BBC economics editor Faisal Islam, recognized the scale of the challenges and how much we still have to do. And Chris Stark, chief executive of the Climate Change Committee, said that since 1990, that's when I started Cobra Beer, we're about halfway through the journey. And that half has largely consisted of changes that don't involve a lot of interference. There is a big effort that we haven't scratched the surface of. So what's the next stage? What more do we need to do? Chris argued that a major gap is that right now government strategy doesn't touch demand, so we need action to change this. Tanya Steele, chief executive of the World Wildlife Fund, said that businesses need to go further and faster. How? Setting and tracking targets, because as she said, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And business and government have made great strides, and in the coming years, we've all got to step up together to reach net zero. And then we had my friend Alok Sharma. And as I said earlier, I've known Alok Sharma's father for many years, and Alok Sharma for years, well before he became an MP. And he was, of course, he is COP26 president, and he said it's all about delivery. And he put it, ensuring that by COP27, we can show that our commitments are leading to action. He reinforced a message we've heard throughout this conference that geopolitical turmoil and Putin's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine should increase, not diminish, our commitment. And to drive that, Alok has launched a new transition task force, as well as working with the Egyptian COP27 team to organize a vital gathering of ministers from over 40 countries in Copenhagen last month. Alok ended by stressing that what government and the world need from business now are detailed transition plans, and that word transition has come up time and time again. We then heard from one of the areas of the economy such plans may be more difficult, heavy industry. The panel discussed the important impact that energy crisis is having on energy-intensive industries. Huge impact. My bottles of Cobra Beer, the manufacturer event, I spoke at the glass industry annual event, came up to me afterwards and said, do you realize we're under such pressure, the cost of my energy is more than the cost I used to charge you for the bottles. How can you survive in that situation? So some of the business investment may need to go into maintaining performance instead of decarbonization. So it's a question of survival for them. As David Dalton, chief executive of British Glass, said, what these industries need to get far down the road to net zero is the right support from government for energy-intensive industries. The other key to success will be innovation powered by collaboration. One of our panelists stated it will take £50 billion of investment every year to reach net zero, an enormous opportunity, and our next panel explored what firms, investors, and policymakers need to do to unleash this. And one of the biggest points of agreement was the need to think long-term. As Sarah Breeden, Executive Director for Financial Stability and Risk at the Bank of England, said, it's key for all of us not just to invest in what's green, but what is to become green. So that's looking ahead. The panel also pushed on the need for financiers to do much more to understand climate policy and take risks to make net zero a reality. And in finance, as much as anywhere, decarbonization is about collaboration, public, private, and international. And then in the panel that I had the privilege of chairing yesterday, we heard about some of the biggest priorities, including financing net zero at COP27. At the first COP in 1995, emissions were 40% lower than today. So emissions are still rising. This is the point that we've got to keep remembering. COP26 built on this, was a huge success, and it's helped ensure that now 90% of global emissions are covered by net zero targets, but we need implementation to hit those targets. And even with those targets, Mary Robinson, to me a living legend, the former President of Ireland, warned we are set to hit 2.4 degrees of warming, far above the 1.5 degree limit that we have all committed to. So COP26 must see more action and implementation, including to support developing countries. Right now, some still need fossil fuels in the short term, so a crucial question at COP27 will be how we can enable them to control their own destinies and to decarbonize alongside, and the transition is going to be the key. And Mary discussed the need for a just and equitable transition. And we mustn't ignore the fact that well over 40% of cumulative global emissions from the beginning of the industrial age were generated to fuel the economic prosperity of the United States and Western Europe, which includes us, even though both account for less than 7% of the global population today, and a mere 2% of emissions have come from the entire continent of Africa. And under current and planned policies, an estimated 660 million people would still lack access to energy and electricity in 2030. So this is the reality and the backdrop we need to constantly keep in mind. Our last session yesterday, we heard from Ed Miliband, the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero, and he highlighted just what is at stake here. He put it, the next few years will determine the next 1,000. And in politics, this can be a vote winner for whichever party shows. It is more concerned about the end of the world than the end of the week. But he argued that there must be a fuller low-carbon transition plan and more work to drive the skills we need to decarbonize, to inspire young people about the opportunities. And finally, what better way to close yesterday than with a reception to launch our new CBI Sustainability Community, the Bain & Company Drinks Reception. It's open to every CBI member, focused on those steering their company's transition to net zero. It's a forum where you can share insight and practice and solve common challenges and mentor and be mentored on sustainability. If you haven't already joined, I urge you all to join and sign up. We began today by tackling head-on the question of whether, with rocketing energy prices and inflation, we can afford net zero. In fact, we cannot afford not to decarbonize. And as Ian Fennell, Hitachi's Energy UK and Ireland CEO, said, one of the most important steps to simultaneously push for net zero and face down the energy crisis is for the government to do more to decarbonize the demand side over the supply side. As he put it, we need to change the supertanker round, change it in 8 years following 200 years of climate change. That really puts it into context. The speaker on our next session this morning, Helen Whately MP, Exchequer Secretary of the Treasury, hit home the point, stressing that we're not now looking at growth despite net zero, but because of net zero. And as I myself have noted many times, in this country, we're blessed with a wealth of advantages. Green finance, our world-beating universities, our professional services sector. Harnessing all these advantages, the race to net zero could present the UK with some of the biggest opportunities since the Industrial Revolution. Our next panel today looked at how we can share those opportunities and use decarbonisation to drive true levelling up across the UK's regions and nations. There is a plan for levelling up from the government, but as Guy Newey, Strategy and Performance Director at Energy Systems Catapult, said, if we don't empower local areas as driving forces, it just won't happen. Businesses, many of them here today, are already forging ahead through our vital clusters. And our clusters, we're so proud of our clusters in this country, clusters like Cambridge, with universities at their heart. But our panelists agreed that we need a plan to supercharge this, and the CBI, we're doing some really important work on clusters. Then we had a panel called It's Time to Talk About Carbon Markets, which covered pricing emissions being a fundamental tool to encourage business action towards net zero. And next, I was in discussion with Javier Echave, the Chief Financial Officer of Heathrow. We learned about how Heathrow Airport lost £4 billion in the pandemic. It's only last month they've started to make a profit, and their business was cut by over 98% during the pandemic. And unlike other countries, he was very frank with us, the aviation sector here received hardly any support from the government, and we're all suffering as a result now. To reduce the 21 billion tons of carbon produced by the airport each year, the key, he said, will be sustainable aviation fuels, which can reduce carbon emission by 70%. Contract for differences can help, and we need a third runway for expansion. Looking ahead, he feels that to achieve net zero by 2050, 50% of the reduction can be achieved through SAFs, but at the moment, SAFs are 6 times more expensive than normal aviation fuel. And the rest can be achieved through new technologies, including electricity and hydrogen and batteries. But, he said, we must be ambitious. We must be humble and ambitious because this is a transition. And he said accountants will be the ones to decarbonize the world. Our final panel today was getting nature positive. Minette Batters, president of the National Farmers Union, who we work very closely with the CBI, one of our 200 trade associations that we're very proud to have as members. She talked about the dangers of thinking about nature in isolation concerning global warming and global feeding. You can't do one without the other. And on that note, nobody talks about soil. I spoke at an initiative to save the soil, where we're trying to get 3 to 6% minimum organic content in soil around the world. And that's something no one talks about. To conclude, 6 months on from COP26, the last 2 days have brought together business, academia, politicians, united in the need to double down on the commitments we made there. And I would like to thank all the individuals and organizations who made this possible. I want to thank our sponsors, Bain & Company, Equinor, the National Grid, our corporate partners, CGI, Estee Lauder companies, Hitachi Energy, and Mott MacDonald. Without sponsors, none of this would happen. So I'm really, really grateful to all of you. And also, I would like to thank our hosts, the Science Museum, and the team at this stunning venue. And I will tell my friend Dame Mary Archer, the chair, what a fantastic location this has been for us. And of course, Tony Danker and the brilliant CBI team, Matthew, who's sitting here, who over the last few months, and Tanya, who was on the last panel, put so much energy and effort into bringing this huge, vital conference so timely. To me, this conference is the CBI at its best. Just look at what I've just covered, the quality of the speakers, the quality of the contents, quite frankly, world class. So I conclude on a personal note. In 2021, well, just a few months ago, I was privileged to receive an award, and one of the other award winners was Professor Sapartha Dasgupta, who wrote The Economics of Biodiversity, the report he published last year. Can I see a show of hands how many of you have read that report or know of The Economics of Biodiversity? If not, read it. He might win a Nobel Prize for it. And in that report, he refers to nature as our most precious asset. He refers to almost 1 million species in danger of extinction. And as Sir David Attenborough wrote in the foreword of that review, by bringing economics and ecology together, by recognizing, as this conference has shown, that decarbonization is not about cutting back, but growing big. Sir David Attenborough said, by bringing economics and ecology together, we can help save the natural world, and in doing so, save ourselves. And finally, I've been very privileged to have been a member of the House of Lords for 16 years. I've got the most amazing, wonderful colleagues. And one of my closest friends there and mentor to me is Professor Lord Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, former President of the Royal Society, former Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. And he recently said this: our Earth is 45 million centuries old, but this century is the first when one species, ours, can determine the biosphere's fate. So there we are, 2 days and 20 minutes. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for being here. Let's go and make it happen. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.